He smelled her before he saw her, not in a cruel way, in the way that a man who has lived alone in the mountains for 19 years notices when something living is close that wasn't there before. The air changed. It carried warmth and sweat and blood and something else, something iron-sharp that he recognized from calving season. He set down the rabbit he'd been skinning and wiped his hands on his trousers and walked around the side of the cabin and found her on his porch. She was sitting against the rail with her legs splayed out and her head tipped back and her eyes closed, and she was pregnant. Not early pregnant, late pregnant. The kind of pregnant where the body has given over everything it has to the thing it's building, and there's nothing left for the woman carrying it. She was young, maybe 25, and she was filthy. Dress torn and caked with mud and pine needles, bare feet black with dirt and cut in places that had bled and dried and bled again. Hair matted and tangled with bits of forest in it like she'd been crawling through underbrush. One hand was on her belly, the fingers spread wide, holding it the way you hold something you're afraid will fall. The other hand gripped a small cloth bundle that she clutched even in whatever half-sleep she'd fallen into. Elias Cork stood at the corner of his cabin and looked at her, and felt something he hadn't felt in so long that it took him a moment to name it. Alarm. Not for himself. For her. She looked like something the mountain had tried to swallow and spat back out. He was 49 years old, and he looked like the mountain he lived on. His hair was long and dark and hung past his shoulders in ropes. His beard was thick and wild with gray shot through it. His skin was dark from sun and wind, and his hands were the hands of a man who had built, killed, skinned, and survived with nothing but what those hands could do. He wore animal skins because they lasted longer than cloth, and he hadn't been to a town in 3 years because towns had people, and Elias had decided 19 years ago that he'd had enough of people. He'd come to the mountain after his wife died, Sarah. She'd been 26 and he'd been 30, and she'd died giving birth to a child that died with her, and the doctor had said, "Sometimes these things happen," and Elias had looked at the doctor and said nothing because, what do you say to a man who calls the end of your world these things? He'd sold the farm. He'd bought a mule and an axe and a rifle, and he'd walked into the mountains, and he hadn't walked back out. 19 years. He'd built the cabin with his own hands. He'd learned to trap and hunt and grow what the altitude allowed, and preserve what the seasons demanded. He'd learned to be alone the way a river learns to go around a rock, not by choice but by the shape of what's in the way. He knelt down in front of the woman, slowly, the way you approach something wounded. He said, "Ma'am." His voice came out rough and strange. He hadn't spoken to another person in so long that the word felt borrowed from a language he used to know. Her eyes opened. They were green and glassy with fever, and they focused on him, and he saw the fear register. This wild man in animal skins kneeling in front of her. And he saw her body try to scramble back and fail because there was nowhere to go and no strength to get there. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words were clumsy in his mouth. "You're on my porch. You're safe." She looked at him, and her lips moved, and the sound that came out was barely a sound. "Please." That was all. Please. One word that carried everything. Please don't hurt me. Please help me. Please don't send me away. Please let this be the place where the running stops. He picked her up. She weighed nothing, less than a feed sack, and that fact made something in his chest crack in a way that would never fully heal. He carried her inside and set her in the chair by the stove and stoked the fire and heated water and found the cleanest cloth he had and wet it and handed it to her, and she pressed it against her face and held it there and breathed, and the breathing turned into crying, and the crying was silent, the way people cry when they've learned that noise attracts danger. He didn't ask her questions, not yet. He made broth from dried venison and root vegetables, and he set it in front of her, and she drank it in slow sips, and the color came back to her face, one shade at a time, like dawn arriving. He wrapped her feet in clean cloth and cleaned the cuts with water he'd boiled, and he did it without speaking because he didn't have the words, and she didn't need them. She needed warmth and food and the absence of threat, and he could provide all three. She slept for 14 hours. He gave her the bed, which was the only bed, a frame he'd built from pine with a mattress stuffed with dried grass and wool from a sheep he'd traded pelts for years ago. He sat in the chair by the stove and listened to her breathe, and to the fire, and to the wind outside, and to the mountain doing what the mountain always did, which was exist without caring what happened beneath it. But for the first time in 19 years, Elias cared what happened inside this cabin. He cared whether this woman lived. He cared whether the baby lived. He cared, and the caring felt like a muscle he'd let atrophy, suddenly being asked to lift something heavy. By the way, if this story is already gripping you, take a second to subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We love knowing where these stories travel. Now, let's continue. She told him her name the next morning. Colleen. She said it sitting up in the bed with the blanket pulled around her shoulders and her hands on her belly, and her green eyes clearer now, the fever having broken somewhere in the night. She told him the rest in pieces over the next 2 days, not all at once, not in order, but in fragments that he assembled the way you assemble a broken plate, carefully, knowing that some pieces would be sharp. She'd been married to a man named Dale Cheswick, who had a farm in the lowlands near a town called Barton. Dale was a drunk and a debtor, and when the debts got bad enough, he'd made a deal with a man named Garrett, who ran cattle and held paper on half the farms in the county. Dale's debts would be forgiven in exchange for Colleen. Not as a wife, as property. Garrett wanted a woman to cook and clean and do whatever else he wanted, and neither of them asked Colleen what she wanted because neither of them considered her a person whose wants counted. She'd gone because Dale had driven her there and dropped her off like a delivery. Garrett was a large man with heavy hands, and the first night he'd made clear what he expected, and when Colleen had resisted, he'd hit her hard enough to split her lip, and told her that bought meant owned, and owned meant silent. She'd stayed 3 months because there was nowhere to go, and the baby was growing inside her, and running while pregnant was a different kind of impossible. But Garrett had gotten meaner as the pregnancy showed. He didn't want a baby. He told her to get rid of it, and she'd said no, and he'd hit her again, harder, and she'd realized that if she stayed, one of those hits would land on her belly, and the baby would die. So she'd run. Middle of the night, barefoot, with nothing but the cloth bundle that held a knife, a flint, and a photograph of her mother. She'd walked into the mountains because the mountains were the one place Garrett's horses couldn't follow. She'd walked for 8 days eating berries and roots and sleeping under trees because the baby inside her was the only thing in the world that was hers, and she would not let it die on a mountainside. She'd found his cabin on the 8th night. She'd seen the smoke from the chimney and smelled the wood fire, and she'd climbed the porch steps and sat down and closed her eyes and let go of whatever had been keeping her upright, because she'd found smoke, and smoke meant someone, and someone was all she had left to hope for. Elias listened to all of it. He sat in his chair and he listened, and his face didn't change, but his hands did. They tightened on his knees until his knuckles went white, and the tendons stood out like cables, and he held them there, because if he let them go, he wasn't sure what they'd do. He was a man who hadn't spoken to another human in 3 years, and hadn't touched another human in 19, and he was sitting across from a woman who had been beaten and sold and chased into the mountains pregnant and barefoot, and the rage that filled him was so complete and so unfamiliar that it felt like a separate creature living inside his chest. "This man," he said, "Garrett. Does he know which direction you went?" "I don't know. He'll look. He paid for me. Men like him don't let go of what they've paid for." "Let him come," Elias said, and the way he said it, flat and quiet, with his white-knuckled hands on his knees and his wild hair and his mountain-dark face, was the most frightening thing Colleen had ever heard, and for the first time, it was frightening in her favor. The baby came 12 days later. It came fast and it came hard, and Elias had no experience with birth beyond the calving he'd done with his livestock, which was more than nothing but less than enough. Colleen labored through the night in the bed while Elias heated water and boiled cloth and did everything she told him to do, because she seemed to know what was happening even while it was happening to her, and he trusted her knowledge more than his fear. The baby came at dawn. A girl, small and red and furious, with lungs that filled the cabin with a sound Elias hadn't heard in 19 years, the sound of new life, raw and demanding and completely indifferent to the circumstances of its arrival. He cut the cord with his skinning knife, cleaned and heated. He wrapped the baby in the softest fur he had. He placed her on Colleen's chest, and Colleen held her daughter and looked at her with an expression that was beyond exhaustion, beyond relief, beyond anything that had a name. It was the face of a woman who had walked 8 days through mountains barefoot and pregnant to keep this child alive, and had done it, and was holding the proof against her skin. "What's her name?" Elias asked. His voice was barely a whisper. The cabin felt sacred in a way that had nothing to do with religion. Colleen looked at him. "Sarah," she said. Elias went still. "You don't know my wife's name. You said it in your sleep last night. You said it twice. Whoever she was, she mattered to you. And this baby matters to me. So that's her name." Elias turned away. He walked to the door and stood in the frame and looked at the mountains and the dawn light coming through the pines, and he pressed his hand against the wood and breathed. 19 years. 19 years since he'd heard that name said out loud in this cabin. 19 years since a baby had cried inside these walls, and now both were happening at once, and the man who had come to this mountain to disappear was standing in his doorway, realizing that you can build a cabin at the top of the world and fill it with silence for 2 decades, and life will still find you. Life will still climb your porch steps barefoot and bleeding and sit down and say please and break your silence open like an egg and fill it with crying and warmth and a name you thought you'd buried. Garrett came 3 weeks later. Elias heard the horses before he saw them. 2 riders coming up the trail, moving slow because the trail was steep and narrow and not meant for men who lived in lowlands. He told Colleen to stay inside with the baby. He walked onto the porch and stood there with his rifle and waited. Garrett was a big man, but he looked smaller on the mountain. The altitude and the trees and the silence had a way of shrinking men who were used to being the biggest thing in the room. He pulled his horse up at the edge of the yard and looked at Elias, and Elias could see him calculating. The wild hair, the animal skins, the rifle, the size of the man holding it, the absolute stillness of a person who has nothing to lose and everything to protect. "I'm looking for a woman," Garrett said. "Pregnant. She's my property. No one on this mountain is anyone's property. I paid for her. Then you wasted your money." Garrett's hand moved toward his belt. The man beside him shifted in the saddle. Elias didn't move. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't need to. It was already pointed in the right direction, and his finger was already where it needed to be, and his eyes said everything his mouth didn't, which was that this mountain had been his home for 19 years, and he had buried his wife and his child and his old life in this dirt, and he would bury these 2 men next to them without losing a minute of sleep. "Ride back down," Elias said. "Don't come back." Garrett looked at the rifle. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the mountain. And he turned his horse around and rode down the trail and didn't look back. The other man followed. Elias stood on the porch until the sound of hooves disappeared. Then he went inside and found Colleen standing behind the door with his skinning knife in one hand and the baby in the other, and her jaw set in a way that told him she'd been ready to use it. "He's gone," Elias said. "For now. For good. Men like that are only brave when they're the biggest thing around. He just found out he isn't." Colleen looked at him. Then she set the knife on the table and sat down in the chair and held the baby against her and started shaking. Not crying, shaking. The deep, full body trembling of a person who has been running on fear for so long that when the fear finally leaves, the body doesn't know what to do with the space. Elias sat across from her. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just sat there being present, being solid, being the same thing he'd been since the morning he'd found her on his porch, which was the only thing he knew how to be. There, steady, not going anywhere. Months passed. The cabin changed, not in structure but in substance. There was sound now, the baby crying, Colleen humming, the creak of the rocking chair Elias built because Colleen needed somewhere to nurse that wasn't the hard kitchen chair. There were smells, bread baking, herbs drying, the clean, sharp scent of soap she'd made from ash and fat. There were small things on shelves that hadn't been there before. A cup with wildflowers, a piece of colored stone Colleen had found by the creek, a tiny pair of moccasins Elias had sewn from rabbit skin for baby Sarah's feet. Each one was a small flag planted in the silence, claiming it for something warmer. Elias talked more. Not a lot. Not the way people in towns talk, filling air with noise because empty air makes them nervous, but more than he had in 19 years. He told Colleen about the mountain, about the elk migration routes and the hidden meadow where the wild strawberries grew in July, and the cave system on the north face where he sheltered during the worst winter storms. He told her about the beaver dam that had rerouted the creek 6 years ago, and how he'd spent a whole summer learning the new water patterns. He told her these things because she listened the way the mountain listened, without interruption, without judgment, absorbing everything and reflecting back only what mattered. She told him about the lowlands, about the farm she'd grown up on before her parents died, about the books she'd loved and the garden she'd kept and the life she'd been building before Dale Cheswick had dismantled it with his drinking and his debts and his final betrayal. Elias listened, and with each piece of her story, he felt the rage settle into something quieter and more permanent. Not hot anger, cold resolve, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that builds walls and sharpens knives and sits on porches with rifles and weights. They married in the summer. There was no preacher on the mountain, so they married themselves. They stood by the creek at sunrise, and Colleen said, "I choose you." And Elias said, "I chose you the morning I found you on my porch. I just didn't know the word for it yet." Baby Sarah watched from a blanket on the grass and made a sound that might have been approval or might have been gas, and it didn't matter because either way it was the sound of a family beginning. 3 years later, the mountain looked different. Not the mountain itself. The mountain would outlast all of them and didn't care what happened on its slopes. But the life on it had changed. The cabin had a second room that Elias had built through the autumn, cutting and fitting the logs while Colleen held Sarah on her hip and handed him tools and told him the window was crooked, which it was. And he fixed it without argument because she was right, and because being corrected by someone who cared enough to notice was a luxury he'd gone 19 years without. Sarah was 3, and she was wild in the way that mountain children are wild, barefoot, fearless, brown from the sun, with her mother's green eyes and a laugh that echoed off the rock faces and came back doubled. She called Elias Papa, and she called the mountain ours, and she talked to the animals the way her mother talked to the garden, with the certainty that they were listening. She had never seen a town. She had never seen a crowd. She had never been hit or sold or told she was property. She knew only the creek and the cabin and the pines and the man with the wild hair who carried her on his shoulders and the woman who hummed while she cooked. It was a small world, but it was whole. Colleen had planted a garden that shouldn't have grown at this altitude, but did because she was stubborn, and the soil respected stubbornness. She'd started trading preserved herbs with a trapper who passed through twice a year, exchanging them for flour and salt and the occasional book, which she read aloud to Sarah at night while Elias sat in his chair and listened, and thought about how strange it was that a man could build a fortress of silence, and the thing that finally breached it wasn't a siege, but a pregnant woman who climbed his porch steps and said, "Please." One evening, Elias found Colleen sitting on the porch watching Sarah chase fireflies in the dusk. He sat next to her the way he always did now, close, their shoulders touching, the kind of closeness that had taken a year to build and now felt as natural as the trees. "Do you ever miss the lowlands?" he asked. Colleen watched Sarah catch a firefly and hold it up to the sky and let it go. "I miss the idea of them, the way they were before everything went wrong. But I don't miss what they became." She looked at him. "Do you ever miss being alone?" Elias thought about it. He thought about the 19 years of silence, the mornings with no voice, the evenings with no sound but the fire, the bed with no warmth but his own. "No," he said. "I survived being alone. But I wasn't living. I didn't know the difference until you showed me." Colleen leaned her head against his shoulder. Sarah came running with her hands cupped and firefly light leaking between her fingers, and she climbed into Elias's lap and opened her hands, and the light flew up into the dark sky above the pines. "Papa," Sarah said, "where do they go?" "Home," Elias said. "They go home. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that the most unlikely places can become home, and the most unlikely people can become family, then you belong here." Subscribe for more stories of second chances found on mountaintops, of love that arrives barefoot and desperate, and of men who remember how to be human just when they'd forgotten. Subscribe now, and don't miss the next one.